The story of Super Smash Bros. Starts in 1989, when a 19-year-old Japanese man, fresh out of high school, joins video game development studio Hal Laboratory. That man is Masahiro Sakurai. Sakurai's interest in video games began in childhood, but it took a real hold on him when he was studying industrial design, originally in an effort to become an engineer. As Sakurai's professional interests moved towards video games, Sakurai would work part-time while studying to buy games for research. He said that he would go out of his way to play games he didn't like or find interesting, as it would be informative for him. He built up a huge game collection, with his view being that each game, no matter the quality or reception, contained pearls of wisdom from his predecessors. As he moved into game development, he realised all of the challenges and difficulties throughout development that can determine whether a game is a success or a failure, and that playing those games is the best way to learn from them. His first roles at Hal Laboratory involved working on enemy movement patterns and character animations for the player character on the video game Tracks, known in Japan as Totsugeki Ponkotsu. Sakurai was ambitious and creative, and was given the opportunity to direct his first game for the Nintendo Game Boy. He envisaged a simple action game, originally using only one button, that could be easily picked up and played by people unfamiliar with platformers. Whilst working on the initial design, Sakurai created a dummy template character, at that point called Popopo. It was originally intended that this character just be a stand-in whilst they thought of a more sophisticated design, but the team grew to love this character, and it eventually became the character we know today as Kirby, with some of the gameplay elements coming from his simple design. Sakurai's parents were initially concerned about him working in video games, not believing it to be a stable path. However, once Kirby came out, his parents soon had Kirby merchandise all around their house, showing their pride. Kirby would come to dominate Sakurai's career for the next 4 years. After Kirby's Dream Land was released on the Game Boy in 1992, to relative success after Nintendo picked up the publishing, he went on to work on a sequel for the Famicom that released in 1993, before working on Kirby Superstar on the Super Famicom, which was released in 1996. During this time, he also worked on a number of Kirby spin-offs, such as Kirby's Pinball Land and Kirby's Dream Course. Kirby had become a character that Hal and Nintendo felt very comfortable inserting into other genres, with Kirby's Avalanche and Kirby's Block Ball also releasing around the same time, not directed by Sakurai. Though Sakurai did not work on every Kirby related game released in the mid-1990s, he would likely have had some kind of knowledge of them, and he was growing tired of his life being dominated by one particular character. He would later claim that the reason he eventually left Hal Laboratory to become a freelancer was because he was tired of always having to work on constant sequels and wanted to have the freedom to work on other projects. In 1996, Sakurai finally had the opportunity to start working on an entirely new project, not based on any previous intellectual property, and definitely not based on Kirby. Originally, Hal had plans for 4 different types of games. With Satoru Iwata's input, they narrowed down those 4 options into 2 different prototypes that they would create. One would be an action-adventure style game, and the other a competitive fighting style game. Sakurai and Iwata would work together on these prototypes, with Iwata mostly working on the programming, while Sakurai worked on the planning, specs, design and movement, with an additional person helping with sound. These prototypes had more time put into them than might normally be taken for a game concept, but the extra time was given both so the new concepts would be more fleshed out, but also so Iwata and Sakurai could get to grips with the capabilities of the upcoming Nintendo 64. Let's talk about the action-adventure style prototype first. According to a translation on Twitter by Push Dustin, this game featured a robot as the main character. The gameplay was set up to feel as if the player was controlling the robot as if it was an RC car. The robot would explore a mysterious underground city, only being accessible by a drill, and only the robot could enter it. The robot would need to hack into cameras so the player could see further into the city. That's really all we know about this prototype. No images or video footage has ever been released, and it really hasn't been discussed much since then. The other prototype was a fighting game. The original project plan's working title translates to 4-player simultaneous face-off no damage battle royale fight. This plan describes the basic outline of how the game would work, that it would have stages with a variety of elements and moving parts, and wouldn't just be flat ground. They had already decided that the game wouldn't have a health bar, and victory would be decided solely by ring outs, regardless of how much damage a player had taken. The fighting game was unofficially nicknamed Pepsi Man due to how the character models appeared, but was eventually more formally titled Kekuto Game Ryuo, translated roughly as Dragon King the Fighting Game. Dragon King is a slight mistranslation though. Ryuo is the name of the place where the game was developed, and it does literally mean Dragon King, but as a place name it probably shouldn't be translated literally. It gained the title because Hal Laboratory's offices were based in Ryuo-cho, and they incorporated their environment into the prototype with a photo of the view of the Kofu Basin and Mount Fuji from their windows acting as the stage backgrounds in the prototypes, the pictures taken by Sakurai himself. This prototype contained a lot of what would make it into the final game. It contained player percentages representing damage, moves launching opponents, and higher damage resulting in an increased knockback momentum. Iwata was particularly interested in the fighting game prototype, and because of his large work schedule as head of the company, he would have to work weekends in order to do the programming on it. Sakurai would later mention that some staff noticed that Iwata only seemed to come fully to life when he was working on that prototype. Iwata stated that he felt something special about the title from the first moment he started the programming on it. He wanted to build a 4-player game that could properly utilise the joystick of the Nintendo 64 and also offer an alternative to the 2-player fighting games that were crowding out the market, showing it was possible to make a 4-player game that offered a new experience every time it was played. At this point, it was time to present both of the prototypes to Nintendo. Nintendo originally decided to go with the action-adventure prototype instead of the fighting game prototype. One of their main reasonings for this was the marketing. Fighting games developed exclusively for home consoles instead of going through the arcade route had often sold poorly, so they felt this was probably the safer bet. Before development could get too far in on the action-adventure game, Hal Laboratory cancelled their upcoming Nintendo 64 game, Kirby's Air Ride. This left them with a hole in the Christmas slot the following year, and they asked Nintendo if they could develop the game, which on paper should take less time to develop, that game being the other prototype. Nintendo agreed, and formal development of the game began. At this point in time, all that was really developed for the fighting game was the core gameplay mechanics. Sakurai had a deep concern around characterization on a fighting game. He felt that it was one of the most difficult things to get right. In an RPG, you're introduced to new characters slowly throughout an adventure, or in a traditional platformer, you usually stay with one character for the whole adventure. With a fighting game, you are immediately introduced to 8 or 16 different characters, with any or all of them being a protagonist, making it difficult for a player to make any immediate connections with the characters. This didn't matter so much in the arcade scene, since players were content with the fighting mechanics rather than the character development, and usually only played for short bursts, but on a home console it was more of a problem, due to the extended amount of time spent with the characters. In the prototype, all the characters were realistic human models. Sakurai considered a number of different options for the characters in the game, including hiring an outside company to design all original characters, or by making all the characters dogs. They gradually started going down the path of looking at their own licenses and potentially making all of the characters in the game characters from Kirby. Following down this same path, they realised that a game featuring lots of different Nintendo characters would be unique and pack the most punch. Sakurai realised that using Nintendo characters would solve his earlier concern about characterisation. They wouldn't need to introduce 16 new protagonists all at once, since the players would already be familiar with these characters. All they had to do was recreate them faithfully. Sakurai initially felt that Nintendo would not let them use their characters in this new game. Instead of asking them outright, they developed a version of the game with 4 Nintendo character models finished, so they would have a more concrete example to show. The first people at Nintendo they showed this to were Shigesato Itoi and Shigeru Miyamoto. The 4 character models they initially created was Mario, Donkey Kong, Samus and Fox. The team tried to break down each character into how they would move, look and fight before bringing them into the game. They thought that Miyamoto's first impression was very important in them getting the approval from Nintendo to use the characters. Iwata said that they needed him to think, with this team I could leave it to them and it'll be okay. Iwata went on to state that they needed Nintendo to believe that Hal could accomplish all of this without Nintendo's development help, so the first impression was very important. They knew that at this point, even using the characters for this was an unauthorised production, and though they had mentioned the idea in passing, this would be the first time they would be showing these characters in the game. In fact, what Sakurai didn't know was that Iwata had asked Miyamoto previously about using the characters, which Miyamoto had refused, so it was all to play for. Iwata said that at this point, they had begun to believe that using these characters was truly the best outcome for the game, so they were not going to back down easily. Luckily for them, their prototype and presentation succeeded and they got the go-ahead, giving the team the relief that they could plough forward with their idea full steam ahead. They found more difficulty with characters that had other licensing arrangements, such as Pikachu, which was controlled by the Pokemon Company. Pokemon Company president Tsunekazu Ishihara was not keen on the idea, but Satoshi Tajiri was more encouraging. Sakurai understood why the creators of these other characters may be apprehensive about the idea. From his point of view, he had seen Kirby be used in other projects and pieces of media without his involvement, and he hadn't been happy with how the character had been treated or presented, and was frustrated he didn't have any say. Sakurai would later state that Smash Bros. In part went down this route as a reaction against that kind of sloppy handling of characters, putting the utmost importance in recreating the personalities and characteristics faithfully, not wanting to betray the original characters' creators. Sakurai mentioned that when working on the game, he always pictured the faces of the people who created the originals. He didn't want to ever betray the creators, feeling a huge amount of pressure to represent their characters properly. Sakurai would make a concerted effort throughout the development to visit the original creators of the various characters, to show them what he had made and get their thoughts. Sakurai's respect for the characters is one of the main reasons he was able to win Nintendo and the Pokemon Company over to this idea. In terms of why the specific characters were chosen, Sakurai later clarified in an interview. He said, "When you think who are the greatest 8 Nintendo characters, those are the ones you think of. The original 4 used in the prototype were picked from a process of elimination, knowing that they didn't want to include Pikachu at that point due to potential licensing problems, and Link had a game in development and they didn't know exactly what he would end up looking like. Additionally, characters like Kirby and Yoshi had more advanced abilities and wouldn't work as well as in a prototype." Early in development, Sakurai even considered making the game just about Super Mario characters, since he felt a bit weird seeing Link slice Kirby up. Some characters had certain features removed, with Link at one point being able to block with his shield. The original 8 characters that ended up in the final version were Donkey Kong, Fox McCloud, Kirby, Link, Mario, Pikachu, Samus and Yoshi, with 4 hidden unlockable characters: Captain Falcon, Jigglypuff, Ness and Luigi. The game featured 9 stages: Congo Jungle from the Donkey Kong series, Hyrule Castle from The Legend of Zelda, Planet Zebes from Metroid, Sector Z from Star Fox, Saffron City from Pokemon, and Peach's Castle, Mushroom Kingdom and Yoshi's Island, all deriving from the Super Mario series. This left just Ness and Captain Falcon to not have any stages based on games from their own series. In addition, there were some special stages for the one-player modes, such as Final Destination, Battlefield, Meta Crystal, and the special game modes, such as Break the Targets, Board the Platforms, and Race to the Finish. The unlockable characters he could be a little less reasonable with, and have more fun about the characters picked. Sakurai later mentioned that he was worried about including Kirby because he thought that as the creator, people may think that he would show bias towards the character and make him too strong. That being said, he did mention immediately after release that he would mostly play as Captain Falcon because he thought he was manly. Jigglypuff was included as a hidden character and was the weakest to newcomers, but could be effective in more advanced players' hands. It wasn't a particularly popular character to start with many fans questioning its inclusion against other more well-known characters. Jigglypuff also had a bad reputation because of the bugs some players found, such as not turning around properly when running. At some points in the game's development, other characters were considered. Marth was heavily considered, but was not possible due to time constraints, as well as the fact that his moveset and design would not have let them reuse animations from other characters. This is because where Link was more of a direct swordsman, Marth would be designed to rely more on technique, so they couldn't simply make him a copy. They considered adding in the rest of the Star Fox members as alts for Fox. There also seemed to have been plans for Bowser, DDD and even Mewtwo at various points in development, but for reasons that seem to have been mostly down to time, all of these ideas were benched. Bowser was mentioned as a character that was going to be included by Miyamoto in an interview, so it seems he was still being considered fairly late into development. Sakurai later acknowledged the reason for only including 12 characters in the game after many fans raised the question on his website. He said that because the game wasn't a port, and because each character had very different physiques and fighting styles, they took a long time to implement, and that was the most they could do. Despite Sakurai's best efforts, there was always some distrust about the game's direction throughout its development. Some people at Nintendo felt that using them in a fighting game felt cheap or tawdry, and when they would see visuals of Mario hitting Pikachu or Pikachu holding a gun, they didn't like those images and thought it was the wrong message for the company. This attitude affected the game's design, with Sakurai making sure that each battle was presented more as a sports event rather than a fight, with the battles taking place in arenas, with sounds of applause and crowd reactions throughout, and with no dead bodies. Sakurai stated that he was influenced in particular by World Cup coverage, in which the announcers would praise both teams, whether they lost or won, without necessarily comparing them against each other. This led them to reject referring to the game as a fighting game entirely, instead often referring to it as an opponent-based action game rather than a fighting game. Sakurai felt that the direction of the game meant that preconceptions of a fighting game would negatively harm how it was perceived, which is why they went down this route, portraying it more like a sports action game. Indeed, in an interview with Nintendo Power around Ocarina of Time, Shigeru Miyamoto mentioned that this upcoming title was more like a sumo game, in which you have to force your opponent out of the ring, than it was like a fighting game, showing that the entire company had got behind this message. Now that they had the characters and the mechanics of the game sorted, the development had a fairly clear roadmap. Included in the original prototype was the damage accumulation system, pressing Z to guard, the momentum and basic fighting mechanics, so development on this front came more down to refinement rather than having to actively work on new features. They had also decided early on that they would never divide the screen when players got far away from one another, instead opting to zoom further out, which Sakurai said represented a true battle. It was never considered to have battles any larger than 4 players in the game, and this was later explained as being a performance limitation of the Nintendo 64 rather than a specific choice made, though 4-player battles were quite a natural fit for the Nintendo 64 given the setup of the console. Sakurai was a keen gamer, and he often played King of Fighters and Street Fighter II in arcades. He often recalls when he had a 50-strong win streak in Street Fighter II and when he won various local tournaments. A moment that influenced his attitude towards game design came when he easily beat a stranger in King of Fighters 95, before he realised that they were just a beginner and him beating them easily ruined their fun. This led him to consider the beginner crowd when designing a game, as well as more experienced gamers, to make it fun for everyone. Sakurai said that he wanted to make a pure game that was just fun, something that was simple, but the more you play, the more you get into it, not heavy on cutscenes or reliant on the 3D stick, like a playground. He said that if other games were compared to novels or movies, then Smash Bros. Could be compared to a sandbox or a field. The music featured many themes from the original games, with some slight remixes and original pieces. Sakurai was once asked why there wasn't more intense fighting game style music, and he said he didn't want to include Heavy Metal Zelda or anything like that, as it could spoil the original creations. In terms of the stages, some went through major changes over development, while some remained rather static. For example, Kirby's stage was the exact same layout of platforms as the stage from the prototype, just with its own graphics. Link's stage changed a lot throughout development, as the team moved the design closer to the design of the castle in Ocarina of Time, as they received information from the game's development. They tried to design the stages in such a way that each would be unique and offer variations in gameplay. For example, Fox's stage is quite wide, whilst others have various obstacles and moving parts. Sakurai said that they found some of these obstacles fairly difficult to implement. Samus stage has rising lava, and it took them some time to balance the area to allow players to move around the platforms in a way that was comfortable yet challenging. They changed this from an early design for Samus' stage, which was set in space. Takahashi mentioned that they would try to find reasoning for the arrangements of the maps based on the characters. This was related particularly to the Metal Mario stage. Takahashi said that he wanted to make a stage that showed the enjoyment of playing Mario, but found it difficult to mesh Mario with the direction of Smash Bros. Takahashi originally thought of putting in ceilings and big dips in the platforms, but eventually removed them, thinking it was better to be a Mario-inspired level that was fun to play in Smash Bros. Rather than be rigid to the original game's formula. They spent a lot of time debugging the game. The HAL debug team would do test matches and report back, which would then result in both error fixes and balancing. Sakurai has said that he found it a very difficult game to get the balance correct. They added in an auto handicap system as a way to allow for any balance and skill level differences. This was all done in the aim of preserving the original goal of a game that was simple yet had depth. He was keenly aware that many fighting games were quickly forgotten and felt this was the best way to prevent that from happening. The single player campaign mode was created only in the last month of development in a mad rush in response to some market testing, which fed back that people preferred games that could be played in small chunks with progress being saved. This also resulted in the score and time attack modes being added. Concerning the famous logo, Sakurai explained this in a response to a comment on his website. He explained that the cross represented the fact that the game was a crossover, and the 4 sections represent that the game has 4-player battles. He also said he couldn't remember the reason for the thickness of the lines. Sakurai mentions that the credit roll was somewhat unusual for a Nintendo game, but it was important for him to include it. It contained so many people because they included the original creators of each character that was represented, and lots of special thanks. This increased the credit roll up from the 30 or so people that actively worked on the game to over 80. Sakurai had an idea that originally the credit rolls would be an interactive tunnel sequence in which you could blow up the credits as they came towards you, but ended up disregarding the idea.
あの向こうだよ。森が見えてきました。本当にあんの？ねえ。何？お姉ちゃん、帰ろうよ。一人で帰れば？ドンキージャングル。ピカチュウ？マリオ。リンクだ。ハービー。フットバスター。ピカチュウ。まさかの大乱闘。任天堂オールスター大乱闘スマッシュブラザーズ。
Satoru Iwata stated that after the game came out, it was clear that it had some chinks in its armour, and the short development period did leave some flaws. Their main priority though was creating something that was fun to play, and if people enjoyed themselves after playing, the flaws didn't matter too much. He said that rating systems often went against them because of these flaws, as they were easy to point out, but in reality those flaws didn't mask the good aspects of the game. Smash Bros released to sales that were somewhat low, however they were consistent. It didn't have big peaks or dips, so over time it grew to sell respectable amounts. This meant that coverage of the game continued in a way that other games normally had a flurry and then nothing, while Smash coverage continued. Sakurai believed that this was due to initial misunderstandings of what the game was. He believed that because some publications reported it as shallow or a kid's game, it gave people the wrong impression. Yet when they actually played the game, they discovered the depths of it and their attitudes changed. There are additionally some reports that depicted the game as a simple button masher, something that Sakurai is able to look back on and laugh, given the kind of strategies that people ended up coming up with. They also suffered somewhat from their original fear, in that fighting games for consoles were hard to market. This is because when a fighting game was released for a home console, their normal selling point was, now you can play it at home, as opposed to an arcade. To combat this, they leaned into the popularity of the characters featured in the game for the marketing. Sakurai put a huge amount of effort into engaging directly with his audience, as he was very protective of the game and wanted to respond to people's thoughts and misconceptions. He created a website with a comments section where people could ask questions that he often spent long hours responding to, alongside a strategy guide, and this website is still up today. The website ended up with over 169 pages of comments and was not only about fans asking questions, but also sharing tips, tricks and thoughts with one another. Inadvertently, Sakurai had helped fans of the game merge into a community organically, without it being forced. Sakurai mentioned that some of the early misunderstandings of the game made him feel down, and some of the press the game was receiving before it came out made it difficult for him to push on. But the positive reception from the players and the community revitalised him, with a particular comment from him being quite telling: "I should have known that players are the most important." This attitude worked, and the game became a bit of a slow burn, slowly garnering more and more of a following. This following was varied too, with tournaments often featuring adults and children playing side by side, with no discernible target audience. This helped the game over the long run, as it appealed to a wide variety of skill levels. This was reflected by some of the comments on the website, in which many people told stories of playing the game as a family. Sakurai was happy to read these kind of comments, and usually responded by letting people know that enjoying the experience was more important than winning or losing, and to utilise the handicap system if the skill levels were quite distant. Sakurai's original feelings were somewhat against the sequel, though by the time it was released, he felt he had only included about 60% of his original vision into the final product. One of the reasons he was apprehensive about making a sequel was the work schedule. He mentioned that he wasn't able to see his parents for months at a time, and particularly missed a very close friend. After the game was released, he met up with that friend, and they decided to play the game together. They played into the early hours, before Sakurai went to sleep. When he woke up, he saw that his friend was still playing the game, and it made Sakurai feel glad that he made it. Sakurai was also not sure what new mechanics he could add to the game, without making the game more complicated, but knew that if the fan demand was there, he would make it eventually. They took the players' feedback into account when working on the international versions. They found that Ness and Kirby may have been too strong, with Ness in particular receiving some changes, his PK Thunder being made weaker in the non-Japanese versions of the game, in order to try and improve the balance. At some point, it seemed they may have thought about expanding on the game via the Nintendo DD system, in response to many people requesting new characters or fixes. However, due to the challenges this would pose, it was probably never realistically considered beyond some passing thoughts from Sakurai. When the international versions were later released, they sold well, with similarly positive reviews. The game did not immediately garner the kind of community it had in Japan, perhaps due to a lack of a central hub for fans to join at the time, and the tournament scene, which had slowly started growing in Japan, would not truly blossom in the West until the game's sequel came out. Looking back on the game, Iwata said that he was deeply moved that the game with such austere beginnings grew to such a great size. Sakurai has said that Smash was a dream project for him, being able to collaborate with many different people and creators and meld characters into a game together. Sakurai would not have been aware at the time just what an impact this game would have had on his life. He was looking to get away from being tied too closely to a single series, yet that is what happened again. The staff at Hal Laboratory all bought into the concept, and despite an extremely tight schedule, they managed to make it work, focusing on a core goal of a battle royale style game with simple controls and hidden depths that respected the works of the character's original creators. The game worked, and although it is perhaps rough around the edges, especially by today's standards, it kicked off one of the most beloved series in gaming, eclipsing many of the titles that it paid homage to. The original Super Smash Bros. Is perhaps not talked about much today, with many gamers not seeing any particular reason to play it over its shinier sequels. It has less characters, less stages, less modes, yet it has a particular charm. The simplicity of the gameplay and the streamlined approach makes it still very fun to play, and although it may seem like it's sitting in the shadows of its successors, I still think it has a lot to offer. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and perhaps sharing the video or giving it a like. In addition, I have YouTube membership open on my channel, which are some exclusive videos, and I'm planning to post more content to it in the future. Additionally, you can follow me on Instagram, Mr. Jordan H.J. If anyone has any suggestions for future videos, please let me know in the comments, or come and chat to me on my Discord, which will be linked in the description. Furthermore, I want to specifically mention one particular source which is very helpful for this video, Source Gaming. They have done a lot of translations over the years, and if you don't know about that website, definitely give it a visit. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.